okay. Thank you. Greg?
Welcome and Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome to the winter series of the Thursday Conversation to End Racism. And may our voices make a world in which we believe, and our words and our choice for our lifetime is anti-racism. As we move into the winter from the fall, we are going to continue to go deeper, and we are going to have you think more about action and influence in the areas that you have control over. We're going to follow Layla Saad's work as kind of a roadmap, and we'll have some very interesting guest speakers along the way. And so urge you to be thinking as we meet though weekly to think about action, and we're going to start moving into more of that because we spent quite a bit of time about defining, and we will continue that. So let's start thinking about how our words can change our world, a world of anti-racism in the areas that we can most easily influence. So welcome, and I want to welcome our speaker tonight. It's a great way to kick off the new series, and it's Ms. Jacky McCoy. She's not only a speaker tonight, but she's one of our participants for the autumn series, and she's going to present on the topic of implicit bias, one of the topics in racism, anti-racism that really interests me because it has a lot to do with brain work. And we're just thrilled that she's our guest speaker. She's the co-founder of Changing the Lens, that's changinglens.org if you want to look it up, as well as an educator, community advocate, and a workshop facilitator who guides community members in the history and impact of structural racism in our country, in our nation. Welcome, Jacky. So happy to see you. It is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I am so glad to be joining you all today, and I'm hoping that you can see my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. And so Greg said it's about implicit bias. Well, really it's about bias, period, because there is implicit and explicit bias, and we're all pretty much experts in it all because that's pretty much how our brains work. And so rather than it be me talking, it's going to be a conversation because that's what Thursdays are for. We need to talk. And so we're going to have 3 opportunities tonight to, reflect on what is being presented, and then discuss your reactions to what you've seen. And so I thought to start off our conversation, I wanted to share a video by a woman named Chimamanda Adichie, who's from Nigeria. And her presentation, it's a TED Talk, and she shares, I'm only going to show a 5-minute part of it, clip of the beginning of her talk, but I want you to listen carefully, and then we're going to talk about it after a couple of minutes to give you an opportunity to really consider what she's saying.
I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamaralaye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. I would like to
Jacky.
I'm there.
Okay.
I want you to hold on to the idea of the single story. And I thought when I was preparing for this, that I'd want to share a little bit of my story. And the reason I wanted to share my story is that, and I know you've heard me say it before, that we don't know a culture when we know a person. We know that person. We don't know their culture. We know the culture that that particular person embodies. But even within a family, there is quite a diverse experience, even with the same or similar experiences, we all experience them differently because we're different people. So it's impossible for me to meet an Asian person and I say, I know Asian culture. I know that Asian, but I don't know their culture. I know what I learn about their culture, but I can't generalize. And so I wanted to share this story. So as I started doing this work of learning the history of how our country became so divided, I am, first of all, I'm from Richmond, Virginia. And I always say the capital of the Confederacy, because to remind myself that that's what it was, and to let people know that that's what it was if they didn't know it. And it's not because it's a point of pride, but it's just a fact. And so as I was learning the history of my state, which I didn't learn in school, they taught us geography. They taught us the war between the states. They never taught about the Civil War. They didn't call it that. And they never really presented the true story. And so as I got deeper into the history of my state, I realized how much the history of my state had directly impacted me and my family. And so recently I had the opportunity to drive down Route 95. And if you ever drive down Route 95 and you come through closer to downtown Richmond, you'll see a church up on a hill, and it just looks so strange because it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere. And that's the church that you see right there, 6 Mount Zion Baptist Church, which was founded in 1867, but the building that you're looking at was built in 1869. And so it's a historic building. It was built by African Americans straight out of slavery. Slavery ended in 1865. And so the pastor of that church, John Jasper, was able to pull together enough of a congregation to start this church, and they were able to save enough money to build this building, which is one of the largest church buildings in the city, and it still exists, it still operates today. But that church was on the demolition block when they decided to run Route 95 through Richmond. And I didn't know, I knew my family was from Jackson Ward, which is where the church is located, but I did not know that the church was on Duval Street, which is the street that my father grew up on. And I thought, oh, well, let me go over there and take a picture of the church, and I want to see if I can find his house because I knew the address. And so I drove through and I looked because he had this T-shirt here, but he never said anything about it. I got to know my father later in life. He really wasn't a part of my life, but he had this T-shirt that he loved. And so when he was in assisted living, he showed me this T-shirt, but he never talked about it. And so I'm thinking, oh, that's pretty interesting. That's Jackson Ward, 2nd Street. Okay, well, let me go find that. So I went looking. And when I went to look for, first of all, his house on Duval Street, and then this particular district on 2nd Street, what I found was nothing, a vacant lot. They had bulldozed the entire section of town where all the commerce in the some of the African American commerce was centered, right? So that they're on 2nd Street as well as on Duval Street. And so then when I went to look for my father's house, again, bulldozed, gone. And I thought, well, now I know why they ended up on 5th Street. So I said, okay, well, let me go and look at 5th Street. And so I go to 5th Street and I realize, oh, it's not there anymore because they built a convention center on top of it. And then I was in Richmond a year or so ago. And I said, I wonder if my grandmother, my mother's mother, who lived in Fulton in Richmond, I wonder if I could figure out where her house is. And so I went with a friend and we're driving through Fulton, and I'm going, this buses in Fulton? What in the world happened? Fulton had been the entire community, not just part. Fulton was one of the first settlements in Richmond of the Europeans, right? They bulldozed the entire community and promised those people there, the African Americans there, that they would rebuild it with better housing. After 10 years, nothing happened. The whole community, which was a prosperous community, was completely decimated. And so as I started doing more and more research, I realized that now I understand why my mother and my brothers and sisters, why we ended up in the projects, because not only did the highway go through Duval Street and they wipe out 2nd Street as part of that project, but it also went through the house. It took the house where I was born, which was further out. And I thought I would go see my, gone. So everything that represents my family, completely gone through urban renewal, highway projects, and eminent domain. And so what I would like us to do is I'd like us to take a minute and just reflect on, first of all, the presentation by Chimamanda Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story. And then I would like for you to think about your own story and discuss the impact of engaging with people from the perspective of a single story, where you see a person, as she talked about, as one thing and one thing only. So we're going to take a few minutes, about 12 minutes. And for those of us who are new, I would like, please introduce yourself in the breakout room so that the new person doesn't feel like they're imposing, that I want them to feel welcome. Okay, Lori?
Sure. I will be putting everybody in breakout rooms, so we'll see you in a few minutes.